Welcome to the Henry George Daily Devotional, episode 29. We continue in Book 2, Chapter 2, Inferences from Facts. We were going through a bunch of facts about Malthus that seem to disagree with Malthusian doctrine, the doctrine that subsistence can't keep up with population. All right, we go. Besides the broad general facts I have cited, George says, there are facts of common knowledge which seem utterly inconsistent with such an overpowering tendency to multiplication. If the tendency to reproduce be so strong as Malthusianism supposes, how is it that families so often become extinct, families in which want is unknown? How is it, then, that when every premium is offered by hereditary titles and hereditary possessions, not alone to the principle of increase, but to the preservation of genealogical knowledge and the proving up of descent, that in such an aristocracy as that of England, so many peerages should lapse, and the House of Lords be kept up from century to century only by fresh creations? I need to brush up on my history of the aristocracy. Oh, Adobe. For the solitary example of a family that has survived any great lapse of time, even though assured of subsistence and honor, we must go to unchangeable China. The descendants of Confucius still exist there and enjoy peculiar privileges and consideration, forming in fact the only hereditary aristocracy. On the presumption that population tends to double every 25 years, they should, in 2150, or in 2,150 years after the death of Confucius, have amounted to 859 to, we say that's 8 times 10 to the 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, a lot of souls. Almost infinite. Instead of any such unimaginable number, the descendants of Confucius, 2150 years after his death, in the reign of Kangyi, numbered 11,000 males, or say 22,000 souls. This is quite a discrepancy, and is the more striking. But George, isn't this is what Malthusian doctrine explains? So this isn't okay. We'll see what George is getting at here. This is quite a discrepancy, and is the more striking when it is remembered that the esteem in which this family is held on account of their ancestors, quote, the most holy ancient teacher, has prevented the operation of the positive check, while the maxims of Confucius indicate anything but the prudential check. Okay, he's saying that this family is held in such high esteem that they would always have enough subsistence to provide for them, that they should be a giant family. Um, Pretty sure Malthus could fight back against this one, but anyway. Hello, Table Cat in the chat. All right, we continue. Yet it may be said that even this increase is a great one. 22,000 persons descended from a single pair in 2150 years is far short of the Malthusian rate. Nevertheless, it is suggested of possible overcrowding. But consider, increase of descendants does not show increase of population. It could only do this when the breeding was in and in. Smith and his wife have a son and daughter who marry respectively someone else's daughter and son, and each have 2 children. Smith and his wife would thus have 4 grandchildren, but there would be in the one generation no greater number than in the other. Each child would have 4 grandparents. And supposing this process were to go on, the line of descent might constantly spread out into hundreds, thousands, and millions, but in each generation of descendants there would be no more individuals than in any previous generation of ancestors. The web of generations is like lattice work, or the diagonal threads in cloth. Commencing at any point at the top, the eye follows lines which at the bottom widely diverge. But beginning at any point at the bottom, the lines diverge in the same way to the top. How many children a man may have is problematical, but that he had 2 parents is certain, and that these again had 2 parents each is also certain. Follow this geometrical progression through a few generations and see if it does not lead to quite as striking differences as Malthus' peopling of the solar systems. But from such considerations as these, let us advance to a more definite inquiry. I assert that the cases commonly cited as instances of overpopulation will not bear investigation. India, China, and Ireland furnish the strongest of these cases. In each of these countries, large numbers have perished by starvation, and large classes are reduced to abject misery or compelled to emigrate. But is this really due to overpopulation? George asks. We continue. Comparing total population with total area, India and China are far from being the most densely populated countries of the world. According to the estimates of Bem and Wagner, Messrs. Bem and Wagner, the population of India is but 132 to the square mile, and that of China 119, whereas Saxony has a population of 442 to the square mile, Belgium 441, England 442, the Netherlands 291, Italy 234, and Japan 233, with a footnote. I take these figures from the Smithsonian report for 1873, leaving out decimals. Messrs. Bem and Wagner put the population of China at 446,500,000, though there are some who contend that it does not exceed 150 million. They put the population of Hither India at 206,225,580, giving 132.29 to the square mile. Of Ceylon, I have no idea where Ceylon is, at 2,405,297, or 97.36 to the square mile. Of Further India at 21,018,062, or 27.94 to the square mile. They estimate the population of the world at 1,377,000,000, an average of 26.64 to the square mile. All right, we're done with that footnote. There are thus in both countries large areas unused or not fully used, but even in their more densely populated districts there can be no doubt that either could maintain a much greater population and a much higher degree of comfort, for in both countries is labor applied to production in the rudest and most inefficient ways, and in both countries great natural resources are wholly neglected. This arises from no innate deficiency in the people, for the Hindu, as comparative philology has shown, is of our blood, and China possessed a high degree of civilization and the rudiments of the most important modern inventions when our ancestors were wandering savages. It arises from which the social organization has in both countries taken, which has shackled productive power and robbed industry of its reward. In India, from time immemorial, the working classes have been ground down by exactions and oppressions into a condition of helpless and hopeless degradation. For ages and ages, the cultivator of the soil has esteemed himself happy if of his produce the extortion of the strong hand left him enough to support life and furnish seed. Capital could nowhere be safely accumulated or to any considerable extent be used to assist production. All wealth that could be wrung from the people was in the possession of princes who were little better than robber chiefs quartered on the country, or in that of their farmers or favorites, and was quartered on the country, or in that of their farmers or favorites, and was wasted in useless or worse than useless luxury. While religion, sunken into an elaborate and terrible superstition, tyrannized over the mind as physical force did over the bodies of men. Under these conditions, the only arts that could advance were those that ministered to the ostentation and luxury of the great. The elephants of the Rajah blazed with gold of exquisite workmanship, and the umbrellas that symbolized his regal power glittered with gems. But the plough of the ryot was only a sharpened stick. The ladies of the Rajah's harem wrapped themselves in muslins so fine as to take the name of woven wind. But the tools of the artisan were of the poorest and rudest description, and commerce could only be carried on, as it were, by stealth. I wonder how George learned all his history, being a not really fully educated man. We continue. Is it not clear that this tyranny and insecurity have produced the want and starvation of India, and not, as according to Buckle, the pressure of population upon subsistence that has produced the want, and the want the tyranny? All right, this is where he gets History of Civilization, Volume 1, Chapter 2. In this chapter, oh no, this is Buckle. In this chapter, Buckle has collected a great deal of evidence of the oppression and degradation of the people of India from the most remote times, and condition which, blinded by the Malthusian doctrine, he has accepted and made the cornerstone of his theory of the development of civilization. He attributes to the case with which food can there be produced. Says the Reverend William Tennant, a chaplain in the service of the East India Company, writing in 1796, 2 years before the publication of the Essay on Population. Essay on Population being Malthus's signature work, I believe. All right, here's what Reverend William Tennant says. When we reflect upon the great fertility of Hindostan, I guess that means India, it is amazing to consider the frequency of famine. It is evidently not owing to any sterility of soil or climate. The evil must be traced to some political cause, and it requires but little penetration to discover it in the avarice and extortion of the various governments. The great spur to industry, that of security, is taken away. Hence, no man raises more grain than is barely sufficient for himself, and the first unfavorable season produces a famine. The Mogul government at no period offered full security to the prince, still less to his vassals, and to peasants the most scanty protection of all. It was a continued tissue of violence and insurrection, treachery and punishment, under which neither commerce nor the arts could prosper, nor agriculture assume the appearance of a system. Its downfall gave rise to a state still more afflictive, since anarchy is worse than misrule. You hear that, you ANCAPs? Anarchy is worse than misrule. The Mohammedan government, wretched as it was, the Europeans have not the merit of overturning. It fell beneath the weight of its own corruption, and had already been succeeded by the multifarious tyranny of petty chiefs, whose right to govern consisted in their treason to the state, and whose exactions on the peasants were as boundless as their avarice. The rents to government were, and, where natives rule, still are, levied twice a year by a merciless banditti, under the semblance of an army, who wantonly destroy or carry off whatever part of the produce may satisfy their caprice or satiate their avidity, after having hunted the ill-fated peasants from the villages to the woods. Any attempt of the peasants to defend their persons or property within the mud walls of their villages only calls for the more signal vengeance on those useful but ill-fated mortals. They are then surrounded and attacked with musketry and field pieces till resistance ceases, when the survivors are sold, and their habitations burned and leveled with the ground. Hence you will frequently meet with the riots, I don't know if I'm saying that right, riots, gathering up the scattered remnants of what had yesterday been their habitation, if fear has permitted them to return, but oftener the ruins are seen smoking, after a second visitation of this kind, without the appearance of a human being to interrupt the awful silence of destruction. This description does not apply to the Mohammedan chieftains alone. It is equally applicable to the Rajas in the districts governed by Hindus. This is from India Recreations by Reverend William Tennant, London, 1804, Volume 1, Section 39. XXXIX. Back to George. To this merciless rapacity, which would have produced want and famine were the population but one to a square mile, and the land a garden of Eden, succeeded, in the first era of British rule in India, as merciless a rapacity backed by a far more irresistible power. Okay, that succeeded was not as in terms of success, it was in terms of what came after. Says Macaulay in his essay on Lord Clive, enormous fortunes were rapidly accumulated at Calcutta, while millions of human beings were reduced to the extremity of wretchedness. They had been accustomed to live under tyranny, but never under tyranny like this. They found the little finger of the company thicker than the loins of the Suraja Daula. We're talking now about the British Empire. We continue with Macaulay. It resembled the government of evil genii, rather than the government of human tyrants. Sometimes they submitted in patient misery, sometimes they fled from the white man as their fathers had been used to fly from the Maharata, and the palanquin of the English traveler was often carried through silent villages and towns that the report of his approach had made desolate. Back to George. Quick comment though is, do we think the British Empire was worse than what came before? I have this general assumption, long history, long arc of history tends towards justice, and that each subsequent empire is a little bit juster than the previous, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, I guess we've gone now for 15 minutes, so goodbye.